Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Exactly how many Australian families will be worse off because of the Prime Minister's cuts to family payments introduced into the Parliament today?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The very clear distinction, the difference between our side of politics and theirs is we stand for the security and the opportunity that Australian families deserve. We have come to the Parliament today with a childcare package that will make childcare more affordable and more available to Australian families. It will ensure that the greatest beneficiaries of this reform are Australian families on lower incomes. It will make childcare more available. It will enable, as the mothers said to me at the Crace Childcare Centre this morning, it will enable us to stay in full-time work. One mother said, "This will enable us to work, enable me to work another day. This will enable me to work another day." And she said to me as I walked out of the childcare centre, Mr Speaker, she said, "When is it going to start?" And I said, "Well, that will depend on the Senate and the Labor Party." And she said, "I hope they support it." Well, Australian families right across Australia are saying to us they want more affordable and more available childcare, and the members opposite stand in the way.
Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? The Manager Opposition Business will resume his seat. The member for Swan. Member for Swan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on steps the government is taking to support household budgets of hard-working Australians and reduce cost of living pressures, including in my electorate of Swan?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question, because he knows, as we all do, that Australian families are struggling under the weight of constantly increasing power bills, which doubled, more than doubled in some parts of the country under the Labor government. And they know that the greatest threat to household power bills, the greatest threat to affordable and reliable energy and electricity and gas are the reckless energy policies of the Labor Party, whether in this chamber or in state governments around the country. Everything we are doing is focused on improving the opportunities of Australian families and the businesses that employ them. And the Labor Party stands in the way of affordable energy, reliable energy, with its unrealistic, reckless, uncosted emissions reduction targets, double what we've already contracted to in Paris, and renewable energy targets, double what has been contracted under the renewable energy target. The absurdity of the Labor Party's position, Mr Speaker, is this. The very workers they claim to represent have their jobs threatened by Labor Party energy policies. And if the honourable member opposite still has a few contacts from the AWU in his smartphone, he could call up the workers at Portland and ask them what they think about the Labor Party's renewable energy targets. We are focused on the concerns, the needs of every Australian family and every business. Now, with childcare, Mr Speaker, childcare, the security of childcare is also a platform from which the opportunity to work and get ahead depends. Energy security provides the platform for households to manage their budgets, for businesses to invest, to employ, for people and their businesses to get ahead, and childcare, security and availability. That too is a platform for opportunity. We are listening to Australian families and Australian businesses. We know that they need reliable, affordable energy. They need affordable and available childcare. We are offering both. The Labor Party stands in the way, driven by ideology, unwilling to recognise that it is their policies that are putting the livelihoods and the jobs of so many Australians at risk.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My questions to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's failure to answer my previous question about family payments. When will the Prime Minister admit that over 1 million Australian families will have their family payments cut because of the legislation the government introduced today? How can the Prime Minister stand there and pat himself on the back for attacking the living standards of over 1 million Australian families?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, I know the honourable member is not a master of detail, but let's be quite clear about this. Our childcare reforms will benefit directly almost 1 million Australian families. The greatest beneficiaries will be families on low and middle incomes. It delivers the highest rate of subsidy, 85%, to those who need it most, earning around $65,000 or less. It would mean a working family on an income of $60,000 a year would pay around $15 a day for childcare. This is enabling more Australian parents, more Australian mothers and fathers to stay in work, to stay connected to the workforce, to be able to balance the obligations of family and the need, both economic, professional and in every other way, to stay engaged in the workforce.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Relevance. This is the second question in the row to the Prime Minister where I asked about family payments. Why won't you talk about the cuts to family payments?
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Prime Minister has the call.
The honourable member talks about relevance. The only thing that he regards as especially irrelevant are the needs, the jobs, the budgets of Australian families. If he thought they were relevant, he wouldn't have a set of reckless policies, the only object of which is to put businesses out of business, to send families to the wall. He has no concern for the economic consequences of the reckless ideological policies he pursues. The Labor Party has pursued them nationally and at state level, and if you want to see what Labor's ideological, reckless approach to energy delivers, then visit South Australia, and there you'll see it, the most expensive energy and the least reliable energy in the country. We are defending, we are supporting, we are securing the opportunities of hard-working Australian families. The opposition has lost touch with them, just as he lost touch with his own members. He sold the members of the AWU out when he was a union leader, and now he's selling them out as an opposition leader.
Just before I call the member for Forrest, the member for Moreton is warned, and the member for Forrest has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. Will the Minister update the House on how the government will ensure appropriate and sustainable support is provided for hard-working Australian families when they need it most? Is the Minister aware of any other approaches that would lead to an increase in the cost of living?
The Minister for Social Services.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. And of course, supporting hard-working Australians was the subject of an announcement by the Prime Minister, myself and the Education Minister today. And how families fare depends, of course, on their ability in the long run to engage in the workforce and employment. And the reforms that we have announced today absolutely maximise the opportunities for individuals to engage in the workforce and to improve theirs and their families' circumstances. So a single parent, for instance, Mr Speaker, a single parent family with an income of $50,000 with 2 children in long day care for 2 days, which costs $100 a day, will be $1,400 better off under the reforms that we announced. That same family, Mr Speaker, if they were using family day care 3 days, will be $2,500 better off. The reforms that we've announced today, as the Prime Minister have noted, will benefit 1 million hard-working Australians. The biggest reforms to childcare in a generation. The greatest benefit will go to hard-working families with the lowest incomes. Families under $65,000 will see childcare costs at only $15 a day, representing an 85% subsidy to childcare. 90,000 families will benefit from the abolition of the rebate cap. 40,000 families will benefit from an increase in the rebate cap to $10,000. Reforms will put downward pressure on the cost of childcare, which were inflated under members opposite. Reforms are estimated to increase the involvement of 230,000 Australians in the workforce. At the same time, there is a $20 increase to all families receiving on a per fortnight FTBA. 96,000 families will benefit from 2 extra weeks paid paternity leave and an extra $1,300, up to $1,300 after the birth of their child. All of this is achieved by closing down end-of-year supplements, Mr Speaker. The greatest reforms to childcare in a generation achieved by closing down end-of-year supplements. A $20 increase a fortnight by ending supplements. More paid parental leave for the lowest income earners in Australia because we're able to reform the family tax benefit system. And I was asked whether or not there were any alternative policies. This is the biggest reform to childcare in a generation. Childcare whose prices were inflated under members opposite over 6 years. And yes, there is an alternative option. After 4 years in opposition to think about this and devise an alternative plan, the member for Adelaide announced the alternative plan for childcare, a national consultation, Mr Speaker. Well, you can hear the sighs of relief from parents at the doors of childcare as we sit here today. A national consultation, Mr Speaker, with child development experts and academics.
The members on my right. The Minister for Urban Infrastructure is warned. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's failure to answer my previous 2 questions about his cuts to family payments and ask, how can the Prime Minister justify ripping family payments out of the pockets of over 1 million Australian families and at the same time propose $50 billion in a tax giveaway to big business?
Prime Minister has the call.
The honourable member has failed to recognise that it is our duty to ensure that our social welfare spending is targeted to deliver the greatest support for Australian families. And that is precisely what we are doing, precisely what the minister has just described. We are providing greater security for Australian families in childcare so that they have greater opportunities to work, to get out, to stay in the workforce, to stay connected with the workforce. You would think, given that these reforms will benefit lower and lower middle-income families the most, you would think that given the way they are targeted so equitably, so fairly, that the opposition would support it. But of course, Mr Speaker, they do not. They are an opposition without any integrity, without any concern for the livelihoods, for the businesses that support Australian families. Their recklessness on energy, their negativity on childcare stands in the way of getting a better and a fairer deal for Australian families. We will always stand up for hard-working Australian families, providing them with the security that they need, whether it is security of energy or of available and affordable childcare, because from that security, and only from that security, springs the opportunity to work, to get ahead, to invest, to realise their Australian dream. That's what we stand for, hard-working Australian families. The opposition should support us because they know that without that security we will continue to see hard-working Australian families and hard-working Australian businesses put under increasing pressure. We want Australians to get ahead, and we are acting to support them as they do.
Just before I call the member for Indi, I'd just like to inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon Mr Stuart Henry, the former member for Hasluck. Again, on behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome. The member for Indi.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister about Centrelink and access for dairy farmers. Minister, on the 10th of November I asked you a question about delays for farm families in accessing farm household support. The House will recall you delegated Senator Mackenzie to host a series of roundtables. These took place where the Senator and others heard repeated examples of problems getting access to Centrelink. My question today is, when will you release the report by Senator Mackenzie about these meetings, and what action will the government take about extra resources to Centrelink in terms of clearing the backlog? And Minister, in asking this question, I understand that the government plans to introduce legislation to the House tomorrow about waiting periods and the water access, which we acknowledge and say that's great, but this will not clear the backlog. The member for Indo's
time has expired. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call and can answer the questions that were asked within the 45 seconds.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for her question. And she is correct. Tomorrow we will be introducing legislation to further streamline the farm household allowance so that further people can get access to this program that's been provided by the coalition government. To date, we've got 129 extra Victorian farmers are on farm household allowance. That brings to 495 in total as of the 3rd of February 2017. 100 Victorian farmers have been approved $53.2 million in concessional loans. What we've done through this program is through Tangambalanga, through Congutna, Morwell, Camperdown, had a series of meetings to make sure that we go through the process of further streamlining the farm household allowance. These meetings, apart from the member for Indi, were also attended by further members in this House and Minister Chester, Minister Tehan and Damien Drum was also in attendance at these meetings. What we've seen with these is that the process and the report, I'm looking forward to releasing it in due course. I can't see really once I've within the next week if I can get a hold of it. And I've got no reason to hold it back. What we have seen also is that in a range of areas within the dairy industry have been brought to our attention. Currently, the dairy price has undergone a step up. At the peak of the crisis, milk solids were at $4.31. They have now gone up for Murray Goulburn to $4.95, and we have reports back for those who have access to water, which is cheap, and also grain, that we actually have people making money now, which is good. And actually, as they have stated to me, they'll actually be paying tax this year. What's surprising, and I'm sure the member for Indi would be surprised about this, is that when the price was $4.31, we instigated a rescue package. Under the Labor Party, back in 2009, the price went down to $3.60, and they didn't do a single thing. So at $4.31, we instigated a rescue package. At $3.60, the Labor Party didn't give a toss about the dairy farmers of Victoria. And it's the same as we speak at the moment, because one of the largest inputs for dairy farmers is the price of electricity. And of course, with the price of electricity, we have the courage on this side to make the affirmative statement that we look forward to being part of the process of building new coal-fired power stations, to get cheaper, more affordable electricity to people. But of course, the Labor Party doesn't believe in that.
The Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. Deputy Prime Minister resume his seat. The member for Indi on a point of order.
Relevance. The question was about social security and dairy farmers.
Yes, well, I've listened very carefully to the Deputy Prime Minister. I judge that he's certainly dealt with each aspect of the questions that you asked within the 45 seconds, and he's entitled to compare and contrast on the policy topic that you raised. So he's in order and he's got 7 more seconds.
So, Mr Speaker, the question we asked, when are you going to come up with a policy to make power cheaper, or don't you have one?
The Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Hughes.
My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on what the government is doing to support the incomes of hard-working Australians and relieve the cost pressures on the family budget? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternate policies that will reduce the cost of living pressures for Australian families?
Treasurer has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Hughes, my partner from the Shire in Sydney, Mr Speaker, for his question. The way to protect the incomes of hard-working Australian families is to ensure that the businesses that employ them and create the extra hours and the extra earnings to support their wages can be successful in a highly competitive global environment, Mr Speaker. To support the investment that supports the businesses and our economy to drive the growth that those hard-working Australians are looking for so their wages and their earnings can increase, Mr Speaker, and that's what our policies, every element of the government's national economic plan, is designed to achieve. The way to take pressure off the household budgets of hard-working Australian families is to ensure that you have policies that can deal with rising prices of energy, which would only be exacerbated, Mr Speaker, by the reckless ideological promises and policies of those who sit opposite. It's by taking the pressure off childcare and making it affordable through the bill that we have brought into this House today, Mr Speaker, to deliver that for Australian families and to ensure that you do not put an increasing tax bill burden on Australian families by refusing to take the measures that are necessary to get the budget back into balance, which is what we're doing, Mr Speaker. I'm asked about alternative ways to do this, Mr Speaker, and I'm not aware of any alternatives put forward by those opposite when it comes to this, Mr Speaker. All we hear from those opposite: higher taxes, higher debt and higher deficits, Mr Speaker. Higher electricity prices, higher childcare prices, higher house prices, Mr Speaker, from the supply policies that have been run by their counterparts in state governments all around the country over many years, Mr Speaker. But if I look, Mr Speaker, at today what the co-author of the Shadow Assistant Treasurer has said about our tax policy. He says in support of our tax policy that our corporate tax regime presents a massive long-term problem. And I'm talking about Dr Richard Holden. The article is called "High Company Tax is a Slow Death." And he says eventually, if we are left with an out-of-date economy, that's what results, and a much lower tax base overall. Now, Mr Speaker, the co-author with Dr Holden, who've authored these comments, Mr Speaker, today, must have had, as the member Deakin has remarked today, an economic policy lobotomy, Mr Speaker, because those opposite have now walked away from reducing company taxes as a way of boosting employee wages in this country. But he's not the only one. There must have been a special on economic policy lobotomies for those opposite, Mr Speaker, because we know the Shadow Treasurer, when he was castigating the Greens for advocating higher company taxes, what he said, it would wreck the economic model, which has led to 21 years of unparalleled economic growth, Mr Speaker. Those opposite have no answers to the needs of Australian families who want to earn more, Mr Speaker, and take pressure off their bills.
Has expired. The member for Jagga.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Kelly Manning is a mum with 4 children who lives in Melbourne and has just completed 6 months of chemotherapy. Kelly will be more than $1,000 a year worse off because of the Prime Minister's cuts to family tax benefits, which were introduced into the Parliament today. Is this Prime Minister so out of touch that he's congratulating himself on a policy which will help vulnerable families like Kelly's?
The Minister for Social Services.
Mr Speaker, the best possible way that the government can help families is to help families engage in the workforce, to help families improve their circumstances. Now, the government has made no secret of the fact that we consider the end-of-year supplements in family tax benefit should be saved and repurposed and reinvested in a plan to ensure better utilisation of childcare. One thing that can be said is that members opposite have made a secret of that fact, and their memories are so unbelievably short that they don't recall that not that long ago, in the first Omnibus Savings Bill, they agreed with the government to close down the end-of-year supplements and family tax benefits for 374,000 families.
Exactly right.
And before the election, they told those families they would not do that. But they agreed with the government that that end-of-year supplement should be closed down for those families so that it could be repurposed in a way—
Minister will just resume his seat for a second. The member for Jagga on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On relevance, because this is a specific case of a family with 4 children that's going to lose $1,000.
Will resume her seat. I listened carefully to the question. The member for Jagga's question certainly had an individual preamble, but that wasn't the question. So the minister has the call. He's in order.
Indeed.
The minister has the call.
There are families with whom you have agreed with the government the end-of-year supplement should be closed. Indeed, you told those families you would not reach that agreement as you led into an election. The government went into a full general election proposing to the Australian people that supplements invented during the Howard and Costello years for a purpose that no longer is relevant, a purpose of reconciling debts that now arise very seldomly with respect to family tax benefits, should be repurposed and spent in a way that produces an ability for Australian parents to engage further and better in childcare. 374,000 families were the subject of that policy that you agreed with the government on. There are 230,000 Australian families.
The manager opposition business resume his seat. The minister still has the call. I haven't, unless you've finished. The minister has the call.
Not yet, Mr Speaker. There are 230,000 Australian families that it is estimated want to engage and engage more in the Australian workforce, but cannot do that because there is underinvestment and a lack of reform in childcare. And for 4 years you have offered them as an alternative
the member for Isaacs.
Absolutely nothing.
The member for Page.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. Will the minister outline what measures the government is taking to support the ongoing success of Australia's $60 billion agriculture sector? And is the minister aware of any threats that stifle opportunities for hard-working Australian businesses and households, especially in my electorate of Page?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question and know that he is very aware of the success that we're having in the agricultural sector, heading towards the first year of over $60 billion worth of agricultural production. This is on the back of record cattle prices, record meat sheep prices, record pork prices. We've had we've got near record sugar prices, turnaround in the wool market, in the fine wool market, and the broad wool market. We're having new exports into new markets, tropical fruits. The wine contracts are turned around. All in all, it is a sign of a very successful government standing beside a very successful industry as we deliver real returns. The best returns back through the farm gate in Australia's history has happened under this government. And we're very proud of the work we're doing because it's real and tangible economic benefits, not only to the people on the land, but also to the people in the towns that are supported by that land. And we see that in such places in your own electorate, and the member for Page electorate. The Big River Group wrote to me and said one of the biggest concerns, of course, is energy costs. And this energy cost is very important because they employ over 300 people. 300 people, I think, in Grafton and also in the member for Riverina's electorate in Wagga. This is incredibly important that we come up with a policy to make sure that we keep control of electricity prices, because they've seen the opposition's position and the ridiculous, untenable position of what they have for power prices is they have one policy. They have a policy to make people poorer. The Labor Party have a policy to put working men and women out of a job. The Labor Party have no policy that supports manufacturing by keeping one of the fundamental foodstuffs of manufacturing under control, and that is the price of power. So you have a choice. You can have cheap power or cheap wages. And we know that the Labor Party have lined up for dear power, so what we have is either no wages or cheaper wages. They are doing everything in their power to put working men and women out of a job. That is where they reside. And we can see this in no better form as when the Premier for South Australia, their doyen of power policy, went to the Riverlands to try and stir up problems in regards to irrigators. And what do they come back with? Don't worry about the water because we can't afford to lift it. We can't afford to lift it because the power price is too high. And then when they come back, it's the Labor Party power policy is unreliable. Unreliable.
The
and they are
Deputy
doing
Prime
this to the
Minister
Australian
knows the
people.
rules on price.
The Labor Party have to determine whose side they're on. Are you on the side of working men and women, or are you on the side of Annandale? Is the member for Maribyrnong going to be the angel for Annandale, or stand up for working men and women? Because we haven't heard one policy from you that's going to deal with the escalating power prices. But we have the bravery on this side to actually grasp this nettle, to deal with this issue, to make sure that we are the ones that deal with clean.
The member for Barton.
Thank you.
Member for Barton has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Human Services. Yesterday, during question time, both the Prime Minister and the Minister promised that the Minister would investigate the case of Anne Foley, a 67-year-old pensioner who had her pension cut up after receiving a Centrelink debt notice for around $36,000 when in fact she owed nothing. Now that he has had a chance to investigate, will he acknowledge any fault at all in causing Anne such stress and anxiety?
Hear, hear. The Minister for Human Services has the call. Minister has the call.
Can I thank the member for that question and also for providing the details of Mrs Foley to my office late this morning. I have had an opportunity to investigate Mrs Foley's case, as I said that I would if I was provided those details. Mrs Foley was sent a letter initially because there was a discrepancy between the income information which she had provided to Centrelink with that which was held on the Australian Taxation Office record. And that letter, as is the case with all the initial letters, asks if that person can explain that discrepancy and if they'd like to
Member for
update their
Isaacs
record.
is warned. Members on my left.
Mrs Foley.
The Minister will resume his seat for a second. As I've said numerous times, when a specific question is asked, members on my left want me to listen to the answer, but prevent me from doing so with a wall of interjections. The member for Isaacs is warned. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So Mrs Foley was sent a letter and she engaged with Centrelink, and her case was actually referred for manual processing. That is when a Centrelink officer takes full control of her case and manually engages with her. Now, this is the process which has been occurring since 1990, and it is also the process upon which the member for Barton says that they would revert back to if they were going to go back to government. Now, unfortunately, this Centrelink official did make an error. The Centrelink official who was on the telephone to Mrs Foley and who was entering the information into the computer system made two errors. She put in the correct income information, the Centrelink official did, and she also put in information about her income into the wrong time period. And unfortunately that error occurs, and unfortunately human errors do occur from time to time. But I point out, Mr Speaker, that the Labor Party's main critique—
The Minister resume his seat. I'm going to say to members predominantly on my left, but not only on my left, I'm seeking to listen to the answer. This is an example where the member for Barton's asked a very specific question and the Minister is answering it point by point. You can't simultaneously expect me to seek to listen to the answer to be able to rule on it, as the manager of opposition business would like me to at certain points, while preventing me from hearing it. I'm not going to keep stopping the Minister. I'm going to listen to the Minister for the rest of his answer. If there's any interjections, have no doubt you'll be out under 94A. have absolutely no doubt. We have a minute to go. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I said, the Centrelink official did make an error in how that official entered the income information into Mrs Foley's file, and consequently an incorrect assessment was made. It had nothing to do with the computer system. That's been the key critique of the Labor Party over the last month, that the computer system has been in error. This was a human error. And Mrs Foley, as was her right, as is everybody's right, sought a review of her assessment, and that review corrected the record, and consequently her pension was reinstated on the 9th of November. But just in the time remaining, can I make a suggestion to the member for Barton? And that is, if you are genuinely concerned about your constituents, instead of putting up cases to the parliament or to the media, which have nothing to do with the online compliance system, raise them with me. We can properly investigate them. If an error occurs, that can be fixed.
The member for Boothby has the call. Member for Boothby has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the Minister update the House on the rebuilding of infrastructure at the Osborne ship and submarine yards? How will the federal government ensure power supply is guaranteed to the Osborne facility?
The Minister for Defence Industry has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Boothby for her question. And I can report to the House that the infrastructure redevelopment at the Osborne ship and submarine yards is very much on schedule. The government appointed at the end of last year Odence Marine Technologies to do a plan for the shipyard, which will be handed to us in draft form in March, in final form in June, and the infrastructure at the Osborne submarine and shipyards will begin in July and the second half of this year. So the government's policies in terms of the continuous naval ship build, the first naval ship build continuously since the Federation, is very much on track for the 12 submarines, for the 9 future frigates, the 12 offshore patrol vessels. The 21 Pacific patrol vessels have already begun, which will be creating a busy shipyard in Henderson and one of the busiest and most modern shipyards in Osborne South, and one of the busiest and most modern submarine yards in Osborne North, creating jobs, investment and growth in our economy. But extraordinarily, Mr Speaker, extraordinarily, because of the breathtaking failure of policy in South Australia over energy and electricity supply, the supply in South Australia of energy is so unreliable that the Department of Defence is having to advise me that we will need to build our own supplementary power generation at the Osborne ship and submarine yards, plus the fuel storage required to run those generators, because we cannot rely on the power supply in South Australia not to go out putting at risk that major project that will eventually be employing 5,000 workers in South Australia alone, and all the myriad businesses across Australia and in South Australia. So the massive obsession that the Labor Party has had with renewable energy, rather than a common-sense, all-of-the-above approach to supplying energy in Australia, has meant that in South Australia, taxpayers, or in fact Australian taxpayers, are going to have to spend millions of dollars more on the infrastructure at Osborne South and North in order to guarantee the power supply, so that in the event that the power goes out again in South Australia, we will be able to continue working for 5 days in the hope that within those 5 days the South Australian Labor government might have got the power back on again in my state. Power in South Australia, Mr Speaker, is more akin to what you'd expect in a backpackers hostel in a third world country than you expect in a first world state like South Australia. And this is only because this is where ideology has trumped common sense, and we are seeing a real-life example of the cost to consumers, cost to businesses, and in this case the cost to the Australian taxpayer.
The member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Athol Hainatz lives in my electorate. He's a father, Army veteran and full-time carer of his son, who as a baby lost his legs to meningococcal. Mr Hainatz was being chased by Centrelink's robo-debt system for about $930 he didn't owe. He was paying $15 a fortnight out of his carer payment while his case was being reviewed. Athol will lose hundreds of dollars because of the government's unfair cuts to family payments. Why is the Prime Minister hurting vulnerable Australians like Athol but sticking up for big business and the banks?
The member for Bruce will leave under 94A. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I'd be grateful if the honourable member will provide me with the details of his constituents' situation, and we'll examine that in the same way as the Minister for Human Services has examined the instance that was raised yesterday. But I want to say to the honourable member and all honourable members that our focus is on defending hard-working Australian families as they seek to get ahead. And what we have presented in our childcare package is affordable and available childcare that will benefit 1 million Australians directly, Australians on lower and lower middle incomes. And what we are doing with Centrelink, as the honourable member knows, is seeking to ensure that those who owe money to Centrelink through error or whatever, we are able to recover it. We don't seek to attribute any blame. We are simply raising discrepancies and asking people to respond to them. The Minister dealt with, in good faith, the matter that the member for Barton raised with the House yesterday, and what was abundantly clear was that those circumstances were the result of human error, not the result of any computerised process. Human error always occurs, and the matter has been corrected. But we are determined to ensure that the social welfare system is above all fair, and that we get the best outcomes for our social welfare investment. That's what we're doing, and that is why our childcare reforms will deliver more affordable, more available childcare to Australian families with the greatest benefits accruing to those on lower and lower middle incomes. That is providing the security that enables those Australian families to seize the opportunity of remaining in the workforce.
The member for Latrobe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Energy. Will the Minister update the House on what the government is doing to ensure that hard-working Australian families have an affordable and reliable energy supply? How does this compare with alternative approaches that would hurt household budgets?
The Minister for Energy and the Environment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Latrobe for his question and acknowledge that in his electorate he has some of Australia's largest potato and apple processors who need reliable energy and affordable energy. And they are some of the 63,000 employees in Victoria who are working in the food manufacturing sector, whose jobs are now under threat as a result of the rising electricity prices. And recently I met with a delegation of vegetable and dairy manufacturers from Echuca, Shepparton and regional Victoria, some of whom have seen their electricity prices go up more than 50% in the last year alone, Mr Speaker. And that is why we, on this side of the House, want to have an all-of-the-above approach, a non-ideological approach which will see coal and gas continue to play a major role in providing baseload power in Australia as well as we transition to a lower emissions future. Now, we heard yesterday that from those opposite, they have a range of policies which will only drive electricity prices higher and destabilise the system. In fact, the Leader of the Opposition in the Senate thinks one of their main policies is a mongrel and a smokescreen. That's what she thinks of one of their own policies. But we know they've got a 50% renewable energy target by 2030, which Bloomberg Energy Finance has said will require $48 billion of investment, which will inevitably be flowing on to higher prices for consumers. And they also have a policy of wanting the forced closure of coal-fired power stations. Now, the Leader of the Opposition is very excited about putting on a high-vis vest and going and having a photo on a work site. But will the Leader of the Opposition have the courage to go to the member for Shortland's electorate, to Vales Point, and tell the 300 workers there at the coal-fired power station that your policy wants to put them out of the work? Will the Leader of the Opposition have the guts
Member
to
for
go
Shortland
to
will
the
cease
Valley
interjecting.
after the closure of Hazelwood and say to the workers of Yallourn, the 500 workers of Yallourn, that you have a policy which will put them out of work? Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition should heed the words of his former union, the AWU, Ben Davis, the current Victorian Secretary, who said, and I quote, "You cannot
The Deputy
run
Prime Minister,
heavy industry
Deputy Prime Minister,
without reliable,
Deputy Prime,
plentiful and
the
cheap
Minister will
electricity."
resume his seat. The Minister will resume his seat. The member for Shortland and the Deputy Prime Minister will cease interjecting. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This is what the head of the AWU in Victoria has said. You cannot run a heavy industry without reliable, plentiful, cheap electricity. The rush away from coal and gas-fired electricity power stations to renewables is crucifying hundreds of thousands of manufacturing workers. We say to the Leader of the Opposition, you don't have the guts to drop your policy, you don't have the courage to defend your policy, but don't sacrifice manufacturing workers on the altar of ideology.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. How can anyone have confidence in a government which is hopelessly divided, which punishes pensioners, which punishes families, and is only interested in talking about itself and giving a $50 billion tax cut to large business?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, it was only a week ago that the opposition leader said he was not going to be talking about politics, he'd be talking about people. He'd be listening to Australian families and their concerns. And this new, non-political Leader of the Opposition was about to burst like a refreshing ray of sunshine into the House of Representatives. But, Mr Speaker, that was a very short-lived hope. We have the same old political bill, the same old electricity bill, the same denial of reality, of economic reality, the same approach where Labor threatens jobs and households.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Deputy Prime Minister will cease interjecting. The Leader of the Opposition.
I seek leave to move the following motion. That the House one notes. A. The Prime Minister has today introduced cuts to family payments which will mean millions of Australians will be worse off, including over 1 million families of school-aged children. B. That the Prime Minister is hurting Australian families with his cuts to family payments and paid parental leave to give a $50 billion handout to big businesses, including the big banks. C. The Prime Minister is punishing some of the most vulnerable people in Australia, including pensioners and carers, with his robo-debt mess. And 2. Therefore condemns the Prime Minister for being so out of touch that his hopelessly divided government punishes families, pensioners, carers and new mums while giving a $50 billion handout to big business, and B. for being so distracted by the chaos in his government that he's only focused on looking after himself and not Australian families.
Is leave granted? Leave's not granted. The Leader of the Opposition.
I move that so much of standing and sessional orders be suspended that would prevent the Leader of the Opposition from moving the following motion forthwith. That the House one notes. A. The Prime Minister has today introduced cuts to family payments which will mean that millions of Australians will be worse off, including over 1 million families with school-aged children. B. That the Prime Minister is hurting Australian families with his cuts to family payments and paid parental leave to give a $50 billion handout to big business, including the big banks. C. The Prime Minister is punishing some of the most vulnerable people in Australia, including pensioners and carers, with his robo-debt mess. And 2. Therefore condemns the Prime Minister for being so out of touch that his hopelessly divided government punishes families, pensioners, carers and new mums while giving a $50 billion handout to big business and big banks, and B, for being so distracted by the chaos within his government that he's only focused on looking after himself and not Australian families. Mr Harbourside Mansion is attacking the standard of living of over 1 million Australian families. The story of these cuts today is that the Prime Minister is taking $2.7 billion from Australian families, and yet he proposes giving $7.4 billion to big banks in tax giveaways. This Prime Minister is seriously the most out-of-touch personality to ever hold this great office of Prime Minister. Tough on pensioners, soft on banks. Tax cuts for millionaires and payment cuts for Australian families. This is another version of the Liberal National version of robbing Peter to pay Paul.
The Deputy Prime Minister will cease interjecting. The Leader of the House will cease interjecting. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Minister, not once but several times today, would he spell out exactly how many Australian families will see a reduction in their family payments? How many Australian families? And this slippery fellow, currently in the position of Prime Minister, spoke about the childcare changes. He deliberately understands and chose to ignore and mistreat question time and not tell the Australian people the truth. He knows our question is that, on one hand, in order to pay for some childcare changes, he is reducing the payments to over 1 million Australian families. And we hear this Minister for Social Services interjecting. If you were doing your day job properly, Sunshine, we wouldn't be seeing these cuts to family payments. The key to the dishonesty of this government, and including all of the members of it, the key to the dishonesty of today's legislation is they want to stand there and pat themselves on the back. They want a bunch of flowers, probably give themselves the afternoon off, because they say, look at us, we're proposing some legislative change in childcare. But the truth is in the numbers. They are reducing what they pay to Australian families by $2.7 billion over the next 4 years. It's in black and white in their explanatory memorandum. So here we have the Prime Minister saying, look over here at what we're doing at childcare. But what they seem to forget is that after kids go to childcare, they go to school. And when they go to school, there are costs and family payments. And then we had the Minister for Social Services get up and say, because Labor has previously supported sums means testing, therefore they have got a blank cheque to rob 1 million Australian families. No, you don't. No, you don't. And I thought, where have I heard this proposal from the government before? Where have I heard it before? The 2014 budget. The 2014 budget. You rolled the poor old member for a ringer, but now you're actually in a new camouflage, in a new suit, selling the same rotten changes for the Australian people. At least the member for Warringah said it for what it was. This fellow here will say and do anything to keep his job. A $50 billion tax giveaway for multinationals and large companies. You can tell a government, not just by the personality, but by the priorities of their policies. And the Australian people are on to you. $50 billion principally going a tax ram raid on the budget to large companies. That is their great economic plan. They don't talk about the old Trans-Pacific Partnership anymore. That died. That lasted less time than your proposal to increase the GST. Their economic plan is a $50 billion corporate tax cut, and your other plan is to make that be paid for by going after Australian families. Well, we draw a line in the sand on this $2.7 billion cut to family payments. We're not buying it, and the Australian people aren't buying it. This is a government who didn't have a great summer. They lost their health minister. They did the robocalls. On, the Centrelink recipients. We heard about Mr Haynitz up in the seat of Rankin. We heard about the question from our Shadow Minister for Social Security. These are real people. This Prime Minister says, oh, the opposition's not asking questions about important issues. We are focusing on the people. We're focusing on the pensioners. We're focusing on standing up for those on Centrelink. In Labor, we don't think that every Centrelink recipient is automatically default a cheat. We don't treat our fellow Australians, someone deserving to have a clumsy system mailed out. But then today we see the legislation on family payments. And this government has proposed in their legislation today not just cuts to families of school-aged children, but to pensioners. And of course, over the summer, some bright spark in the government thought up they should spy on our veterans to see if they really have PTSD by monitoring their social media. So I thought they had a bad summer, and of course, we won't even go near the donations debacle, the biggest donation in history. But you know what? That is looking like a summer of joy in the last 48 hours. Not only have we given up on the government, their South Australian senators given up on the government. But we will keep fighting. We will keep fighting to defend family payments. We will keep fighting to expose the charade of this government's position. At the heart of this government's position, it is the following proposition. They say on one hand, look at us, aren't we good? We're doing some things in childcare. But on the other hand, all of this question time, they haven't answered the question, how many Australian families are having a reduction in their payments? How many? I tell you what, my respect for you might go up an inch or two, Mr Prime Minister, if you'd come to the dispatch box and just spell out how many Australian families are losing or seeing reductions in their family payments, families of school-aged children. You've ducked and you've weaved that question all question time, and no matter how often you duck and weave it, no matter how often you hide from it, we will get that number out of you and we will speak up for Australian families. This is a very divided government. Their only plan for the Australian economy is to kill the confidence of Australian families. They treat the people on the pension as somehow second class. They treat people on Centrelink as somehow second class. I actually thought in the first 3 question times of this week the beleaguered Minister for Human Services would have enough self-respect when asked a question about Centrelink to get up and say, I'm sorry, we got it wrong. Just a bit of humility would go a very long way, but that is not the trademark of this government.
The member for Deakin is warned.
We will fight for family payments. This Prime Minister is not just out of touch. With today's legislation, it shows he's out of ideas and he's rapidly running out of time, and his own party know it. And the difference is, every time this Prime Minister sees an issue, he turns it into politics about Labor. We say to the Prime Minister today, if you want to make a step forward in terms of Australian politics, if you want to make a step forward in terms of your own approval of what Australians think of your government, focus on what matters. The Labor Party is focused on what matters to Australians. We will stand up for Australian jobs. We will do something about reforming the visa system. We will stand up for Australian apprenticeships. We will make sure that we have proper needs-based funding in our schools. We'll also, if you want to find some money in the budget, rather than reaching down into the pockets of over 1 million Australian families of school-aged children, what we think you should do is reform negative gearing. Reform the capital gains tax deduction system. Don't pass on $50 billion in corporate tax cuts. If you want to find some money, look, go after some of the top end of town, but rather than going after everyone else. The Prime Minister doesn't have a plan for Medicare. His only plan for Medicare is to change the salesman. That doesn't fill people with a lot of confidence. But he also doesn't have a plan for housing affordability, does he? This fellow is so out of touch that his only advice to Australians is get rich parents. Well, that's not a housing affordability policy. So we stand for Australian families. We don't support the cuts. We'll back Medicare. We'll make sure that housing affordability is a reality in this country.
Is the motion seconded? The member for Jagga.
I second the motion, reserve my right to speak.
The Prime Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, we've just heard from that great sycophant of billionaires, the Leader of the Opposition. All the lectures he trying to run a politics of envy. When he was a regular dinner guest at Raheen, always there with Dick Pratt, sucking up to Dick Pratt. Did he knock back the Cristal? I don't think so. There was never a union leader in Melbourne that tucked his knees under more billionaires' tables than the Leader of the Opposition. He lapped it up. Oh yes, he lapped it up.
Members on my right.
He was such a sycophant, a social climbing sycophant, if ever there was one. There has never been a more sycophantic leader of the Labor Party than this one, and he comes here and poses as a tribune of the people. He, like Harbourside Mansions, he's yearning for one. He's yearning to get into Kirribilli House. You know why? Because somebody else pays for it. And just like he loved knocking back Dick Pratt's Cristal, justly look forward to living in luxury at the expense of the taxpayer. This man is a parasite. He has no respect for the taxpayer. He has no respect for the taxpayer any more than he has respect for the members of the Australian Workers' Union. He betrayed again and again. He sold them out. He sold them out. Some of the lowest paid workers in Australia, cleaners working at Clean Event, he sold out their penalty rates, and what did they get? They got nothing. But what did the union get? Cash money, payments. He sold them out in return for a payment to the union. That's what he did when he was their representative. And what does he do now? What does he do now as Leader of the Opposition? He is selling out the jobs of Australian workers. Every day he perseveres with his ludicrous policies on energy, which will have the result of further unsustainable increases in the cost of electricity. Now, I think I've seen more members of the AWU lately than he has. I saw them at Portland Aluminium, and they know that their jobs depend on affordable electricity, and they know that with the closure of Hazelwood and the crazy policies of the Victorian Labor government, supported by the policies of the Leader of the Opposition, they know that their livelihoods are at risk. And where is the champion of the AWU now? He's here in Canberra. He's here in Canberra selling them out just like he sold out the workers at Clean Event. He has no interest in standing up for those workers. Mr. Speaker, I was also at Viridian Glass, also members of the Australian Workers' Union there. Viridian Glass's biggest element in its cost, the most volatile element in its cost, is the cost of energy, the cost of gas. It is becoming unaffordable. They moved their plant from New South Wales to Victoria. They closed their plant in New South Wales because energy was too expensive. They consolidated in Victoria, and now, thanks to the Labor Party's energy policies, driven by ideology, that too is put at risk. That is the reality. That is the front line where members of the Australian Workers' Union and many other unions find themselves today. The Labor Party cannot keep living in a parallel universe where you can preach ideological energy policies without any regard to how you are going to deliver reliable, affordable energy and, yes, meet your emission reduction targets, but meet the responsible ones we entered into in Paris, not just doubling it for no return from any other country. This is ideology. They call themselves the Labor Party. Well, Mr. Speaker, manual labour's a Mexican bandit as far as they're concerned. Most of them have never done a day's work in their lives. I'm old enough to remember when the Labor Party's benches were filled with union officials who'd actually worked. Nowadays, look at the serried ranks of apparatchiks and political hacks. That is totally out of touch with the men and women they claim to represent. Now, Mr. Speaker, this social climbing sycophant, this would-be tribune of the people, complains about cuts to company tax. Well, let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, it's pretty straightforward. If you want more investment, and we do, then you want to increase the return on investment. You want to lower company tax. And that has been the consistent policy of governments of both political persuasions for many years. And in terms of consistency, let's have a look at what the Leader of the Opposition used to say about it. In 2012, he said right here, "As Australia is buffeted by economic events overseas, we understand that lowering corporate tax assists the creation of jobs." Lowering corporate tax assists the creation of jobs. And the social climber warming to the occasion, went on to say, what can be more important in this country than the creation of jobs? I reckon he probably talked about that with Dick Pratt and Solly Lew and Lindsay Fox and all the other billionaires he likes sucking up to in Melbourne on their corporate jets. Or did he give them the sort of the blast of the sort of the good, you know, attack on the rich, down with anyone that's got to quit? Did he give them that? I don't think so, Mr. Speaker. You know, no, I think he just sucked up to them. You know, I think he says one thing here and another thing in the comfortable lounge rooms of Melbourne. I reckon. I think we all know that. I think we know that. And then on company tax, he's quite an authority on it. The year before, he said cutting the company income tax rate increases domestic productivity and domestic investment. More capital means higher productivity and economic growth, and leads to more jobs and higher wages. I reckon he said that. I reckon Dick probably broke out an extra bottle of Cristal, wouldn't you say? For that, they would have all been very pleased when to hear that. They'd say, you know, he's not like some of those other Labor people. He's really one of us. He's really on side. He's really on side. But now, of course, he's a wholly owned subsidiary of some very left-wing unions, and he has shifted, and he will say whatever suits his purpose from day to day. No consistency, no integrity. This sycophant, this simpering sycophant, blowing hard in the House of Representatives, sucking hard in the living rooms of Melbourne. What a hypocrite. And you know, Mr. Speaker, he said, going on to company tax, he said in 2012, he said, any student of Australian business and economic history since the mid-80s, so that would include Dr. Lee, I reckon, knows part of Australia's success was derived through the reduction in the company tax rate. Yeah, that's what did it. That's what did it. Oh, they ordered the billionaires of Melbourne. They'd lap that up. They'd love that. We need to be able to make life easier for Australian businesses who employ 2 out of every 3 Australians. You know, it's actually more than that. It's more like 4 out of 5 every Australians are employed in the private sector. And they are the businesses, large and small, that need to invest, and the more they invest, the more they employ. It's pretty simple. He was right then. He was right in 2011 and 2012. But now, the sycophant is wrong. This sucker up in Melbourne, billionaire's friend to then. But now the great radical tribune, the great radical advocate of the people. Give me a break, Mr. Speaker. This bloke has no consistency, no integrity. He cannot be believed. He says he's against 457 visas. Well, he knows more about 457 visas than anyone. He is the Olympic champion. He expanded the categories dramatically. He opened wide the door as the same, following on his triumph of selling out the workers at Clean event, selling out the members of his own union in return for a backhander paid to the union. He then let in, opened the doors as wide as he could. And he wants to talk about political donations. Well, let me say this, Mr. Speaker. Just remember this. It took 7 years and a Royal Commission for him to disclose a $40,000 political donation. Mr. Speaker, the Labor Party cannot be trusted with economic management. It cannot be trusted with jobs. It cannot be trusted to deliver the opportunity and the security Australian families deserve.
The members on my right, member for Jagga, we'll just wait for a second. The member for Reid is warned. I'm trying to address the House. The question is that the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition be agreed to. The member for Jagga.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, what an extraordinarily angry rant.
Member for Jagga has the call.
An extraordinarily angry rant from someone who is supposed to be a Prime Minister standing up for Australian families.
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection will cease interjecting. Member for Jagga has the call.
Let's actually look at what this Prime Minister didn't say. Didn't say in the whole 10 minutes that he had to speak about Australian families. This Prime Minister was supposed to get up and actually defend what this government is doing to Australian families. 1 million Australian families are going to see their family tax benefits cut as a result of the legislation that was put into the Parliament by this government today. 1 million Australian families are going to see their payments cut. That's families. Let's actually look at...
The Deputy Prime Minister is now warned. The member for Jagga has the call.
Let's actually look at what that means for real families, for people like Kelly that I spoke about in question time today, which of course the Prime Minister completely ignored, and all the other families that are writing and ringing our offices this morning saying to us, please do everything you possibly can, because these cuts to a family like Kelly's are going to mean that I'm $1,000 worse off. That's what Kelly said to me this morning. That's what's going to happen to Kelly's family. But what we get from the Prime Minister, this angry Prime Minister, this very, very angry Prime Minister who's so worried about the fellow up the back, what this Prime Minister is auditioning for is the challenge that's going to come from the bloke up the back, when what he should be doing is standing up for the needs of Australian families. What Australian families know is this Prime Minister is going to leave families like Kelly's $1,000 worse off, and $1,000 worse off each and every year. And each and every one of you are just going to be like little sheep following this Prime Minister, voting for these cuts to your families, and those families are going to make sure you know about it. But of course, this legislation wasn't just about families. This legislation that's been put into the Parliament this morning is also going to see cuts to the energy supplement. In fact, the abolition of the energy supplement that will see pensioners, carers, and of course people with disability, people on New Start, all of those people are going to lose hundreds of dollars because of the cuts of this government to all of those people. That's exactly what this government is going to do. And of course, what do they want these cuts for? Why are they cutting family payments? Why are they abolishing the clean energy supplement? Because they want to give $50 billion to the richest companies in Australia. So it's pensioners, people with disability, carers, unemployed people, young people, new mums, families. All of those people are going to face cuts, or as the Minister for Social Services likes to call it, repurposing. They're going to see all of this money repurposed, which is actually a cut to family tax benefits, a cut that will see thousands and thousands of people worse off. This Prime Minister, I just say to him after his extraordinarily angry rant today, I'd see the Leader of the Opposition's defence of working people any day ahead of yours.
Yeah. The time allotted for this debate has concluded. The Prime Minister, just before I
Thank
put
you,
the
Mr. Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice.
The Prime Minister, we have a motion before the House. Yep. Yes, we need to do the motion first, unfortunately. The question is that the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes.
Judge wants to.
I just looked at my diary.
Chris. Here. Here.
Lock the doors. Order. The question is that the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I call the honourable members for Lawler. I appoint the honourable members for Lawler and Morton tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Gray and Dawson tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 67, noes 75. The question is therefore resolved in the negative. Prime Minister.
That further questions be placed on the notice paper.
I thank the Prime Minister. The Leader of the